Corsair's new Spec-04 case uses the same internal tooling as the Spec-01 from a few years back, borrows from the newer Spec-alpha, but lowers the price point to $50 and reduces fan count to one 120mm intake pre-installed fan. For a lightweight box at $50, it seems suitable for ultra-budget PC builds, but we'll soon find out how it performs thermally, acoustically, and how the quality holds up to a real build. Before getting to that, this content is brought to you by v1tech.com, who make the custom backplates shown in our B-roll on the screen of the MSI Gaming X. They've also got plenty of other backplates. You can go to their website and use code GAMERSNEXUS5 for $5 off. Click the link in the description below for more information. We've got a lot of testing for this case in this one, including some frequency versus time plots, which we don't normally need with cases, but we'll show you why in a bit. And then we also have some tests of what happens if you add a fan in the front or in the back slot. But going over the basics first before getting into the testing, it's a $50 enclosure. That means that obviously you can't be too picky about the different small things on the case that you might ding a larger, more expensive case for. But with this one, what you're looking at is a budget-targeted build. The tooling is the same internally as the Spec-01. If you know the Spec-01, you pretty much know what this looks like internally. The Spec-alpha is not too different. It's a bit different in the visual department exterior-wise, but internally not too many changes. For this case, there's a drive cage in the bottom front. It is separable. You can remove it, and if you do that, you could add another front intake fan in the bottom, potentially helping with GPU cooling. There's a front intake fan option in the top, but the included intake fan is a 120mm with an off-white, off-blue, white LED dead center that splits air between the CPU and the GPU. We'll test that in a bit. The top, there are two mounting options, but the clearance in the top is not that great. As you've noticed, this is a pretty small case, and being a small case, that means that your movement and your ability to fit different things up there is going to be limited based on the CPU cooler you choose and other things like that. There's also a rear exhaust option if you wanted to install a fan in the back. And then for the rest of the case, we're looking at limited side panel cable management, but enough to get you by with a budget build, and bottom-oriented PSU, no PSU shroud whatsoever, which helps save on cost. Not everything needs a shroud anyway. In terms of the dimensions, this case is 492 by 201 by 433mm. It weighs 4.2 kilograms empty, so it's pretty damn light, and it's a small box. The front panel I/O has one USB 3.0 port and one USB 2.0 port, so rather than bundling two USB 3 into one cable, which is what you normally find, they've gone with one-on-one USB 3 and USB 2. So not a favorite there, but really not that big of a deal. The Spec-alpha has two USB 3 if you preferred it, and is currently available around $60, $63, so not that much more expensive. Other than that, cable management isn't bad. It's really nothing to write home about. It's not dismal. You can hide stuff in the back. There are cable tie points in the back, so you can hide stuff and tie it down, but it's not necessarily going to be the prettiest without a lot of work. So you'll have to put some time in managing cables. Interior is pretty straightforward, build process, nothing is special here, nothing's different from normal PC building. The back, the rear I/O, and the expansion covers have the offset screws in the back of the case rather than inside the case, which personally I prefer. That's more of a subjective preference thing, but I do prefer when they've exposed the screws for the expansion devices like the video card through the outside, because then you can get at the screw without cross-threading. So that's always a nice thing to see, and it's a small thing. But other than that, this is a standard case, so we'll just roll straight into the testing. For testing methodology, as always, check the article linked in the description below, where we've also got Patrick Lathan's written review of this case. He's the one who worked with the build for the most part. And then for testing, we've got a few new things here. So first of all, we've been slowly rolling out some new thermal tests for these, and that includes a blender pass on the CPU and a blender pass on the GPU. That gives you a real world scenario to look at rather than just stress testing. And we've also added a 3D Mark pass, which sort of simulates gaming because it's load on both the GPU and the CPU, but it's not as torturous as the power virus workloads that we run for our torture scenario to see where the maximum potential is for all these cases in terms of thermals. So that's been added. We have the normal noise testing, and we've also up front got some extra fans. We positioned an extra fan in the front top up here, which helps with CPU airflow for the most part. And we also positioned one in the back. They're both 120mm fans. We did not do more than one fan for the extra fan testing because honestly, if you're spending $50 on a case and then $8 on a fan, you add a second fan, you're basically spending $20 more. You might as well just buy a better case. So there's no real point in testing that. from our standpoint. You may as well look at something like a 270R windowed version for $70. Save yourself the trouble and get something that's better out of box altogether anyway. So we test with one extra fan, top, front, and back, and then the stock configuration. Let's start with the extra fan testing, then do the competitive testing against other cases. Starting with the CPU torture test temperatures for extra fans, we see that adding a fan to the front grants an immediate performance uplift about 10 Celsius, reducing temperatures to 57.8 Celsius delta T over ambient. This helps dramatically in CPU temperatures and brings us down under throttling territory. Unfortunately, the fan is partially obstructed by the front panel, so its ability to improve thermals is limited by this. And for that reason, the rear exhaust configuration also helps about the same amount, marginally more, just outside of our test resolution, and can be explained by ridding of radiative heat off the GPU backplate, in addition to being less obstructed as the front fan is. Either way, adding one fan to the case helps tremendously and would be worthwhile as an investment for $8, $10, but no more than that. Here's a look at CPU frequency versus time with these configurations. With the stock configuration, we can see clear throttling as the CPU enters 90 to 100C range of our torture workload. Keep in mind that this will vary heavily based on the CPU cooler you've selected, and also will depend on the type of workload you're putting the CPU through. We're using a torture scenario here, so it gets a bit better after this. This is one of the worst cases. Adding a fan in either configuration removes the throttle event and smooths things out for the CPU overall. Looking at GPU temperatures after adding an extra fan, we see a reduction from 64 Celsius delta T over ambient, which is roughly the throttle point after you factor in ambient, to around 60.5 Celsius delta T with an extra rear fan, or around 60 Celsius with an extra front fan. Performance between these two is insignificantly different, meaning that they are within test-to-test variance and resolution and accuracy of our testing. The two are effectively the same for GPU performance, and we can't really claim a definitive advantage between front and rear mount options, especially given that case testing varies so much based on configuration. What we can say is that adding a fan is definitely worthwhile, especially if you can get one for less than $10 so that the case doesn't really exceed the $60 mark. 3D Mark is one of our new introductions to case testing. We're using a looping Firestrike Extreme test for half an hour here, producing a load on both the CPU and GPU, but in less torturous of a manner than the one done in the Extreme Burn-In that was just shown previously. This more closely resembles gaming workloads for extended periods of time, and as the tests are new, we are still adding to the charts and only have 2 devices presently plotted. The Corsair Spec-04 runs a CPU temperature of 38.9 Celsius delta T over ambient in the 3D Mark Burn-In, which is about 9 Celsius higher than our open-air Core P3 configuration, effectively the resting state of where you'd be testing without an enclosure. The GPU temperatures run about 5 Celsius higher with a delta T of 59.4 Celsius on the Corsair configuration. To get a better idea of how this looks in reality, let's look at a frequency versus temperature chart like we do in our GPU reviews. In this chart, we can see how GPU frequency responds to rising temperatures. Our fan is fixed to 55% RPM, which is around where the GPU fans tend to configure their maximum profile before sacrificing frequency rather than noise, but it depends on what you buy, of course. Technically, you could run a higher GPU fan speed and solve for this frequency throttling problem, but you'd be drastically increasing noise, something to the effect of 2 times perceived noise increase, depending on what video card is used, if you start pushing the 80 to 90% fan speed territory. Regardless, there's a clear downtrend in core frequency until a point where it fluctuates between the high 1700s and low 1800s, resultant of an 84 Celsius maximum desirable GPU core temperature. The VBIOS begins throttling back performance to sustain this temperature target under stock configurations, which means losing frame rate due to heat, and again, this isn't a torture workload, it's just 3D Mark. Moving on from the torture workload and from 3D Mark, we can look to Blender next, which are real use cases for 3D animators everywhere. With CPU rendering enabled, we see the Corsair Spec-04 with a single fan pushing the CPU to 43.5 Celsius delta T over ambient with our cooler. This is about 6.1 Celsius warmer than an open Thermaltake Core P3 configuration, which runs a load CPU DT of about 37.3 Celsius. Idle temperatures are also a few degrees higher on the GPU, which isn't doing work in this scenario, but is still humming along in the box. Moving to Blender GPU rendering, we've only got 2 cases on this chart as it's still new, but it's a good first look. The Corsair Spec-04 with its single fan at 1300 RPM runs a CPU DT of about 35 Celsius over ambient, with the GPU load delta temperature at 37.6 Celsius over ambient. The SilverStone RL06 at 1000 RPM with its 3 120mm front fan and 1 120mm rear fan in configuration is able to sustain a 22 Celsius delta T CPU temperature and 24.7 Celsius delta T over ambient GPU temperature. And for an extra $15, that's a significant reduction in thermals. So if thermals matter to you, if you're going to be running 100% workloads on 1 or 2 of your components at any given time, it's worth considering the upgrade. Finally, for torture workload tests, check our article in the description below for more information on this, but we can briefly go over them. This chart shows the CPU temperature under our GPU and CPU torture scenario, placing the Corsair Spec-04 toward the bottom of this chart for the CPU load and idle temperatures, running a 68 Celsius delta T over ambient value. The GPU torture temperatures are also among the worst, pushing us up against the 84 Celsius threshold for this card before we start throttling on the clock. This is the same torturous workload that we used for the initial extra fans test. And again, case testing is the least scientific testing of all for components just because there are so many configuration options, even between blower fans and dual axial fans, or just the component power draw of the CPU and the GPU. But from this, we can still garner a baseline performance based on where we fall with the other cases that we've tested on our bench, and the torture workloads kind of give the biggest look at that, but we're expanding the 3D Mark workloads as well. What we learn here is that maybe if you had a GPU like a 1050 or 1050 Ti, you would be okay in this case. It'd still certainly be warm depending on how good that GPU cooler is, but you'd have more headroom to work with than a higher end device. That said, if you're planning to run your CPU at 100% workloads or high percentage utilization at any given time, for example, if you're doing Blender rendering, any kind of benchmarking, or if you're just running applications that are very CPU intensive, like Excel when it's crunching all the formulas, then you might want to consider adding that extra fan to the front top, because again, a 10 Celsius decrease with this configuration, which is not an abnormal one that we tested for someone buying a case like this, it's a worthwhile investment. And when I say not an abnormal one, you might not buy a GTX 1080 for the case, of course, but for the cooler, you're probably going to have a tower cooler not dissimilar from the one we used, which is about a $30 tower cooler. If you bought a Hyper 212, it would be the same sort of configuration in terms of how the airflow works. Stock cooler is a bit different, but stock coolers can be worse anyway. So if you're running a stock cooler, that further solidifies that you should get the front fan extra for a couple bucks and call it a day. But there's a reason we look at temperatures beyond just the thermal reasons. We also look because noise. So even if you're going to be running a GPU temperature of 60 to 70 Celsius for a lower end card, it doesn't mean you have to run the higher noise output to sustain that temperature if you have a better case. So what I'm saying is, if you get something like a better case, maybe the RL06, you can get away with running slower internal fan RPMs on the CPU cooler and especially the GPU cooler, and therefore a lower noise output, provided the fans in the front of the case are obviously within a reasonable noise output as well. So you've got more noise variance and range there that you can control for if you have a better case and a better baseline cooling to begin with. If you don't care about noise and you don't necessarily care about temperatures, then disregard all of that and buy what looks best. The Corsair Spec-04, by nature of running a single fan, is able to get away with a lower noise output though than some of its neighbors. So let's look at the noise chart. The case doesn't make any attempts to contain noise, especially with that front mesh intake, but it also doesn't emit much given system components that are reasonably inaudible. We measured about 36.7 dBA output with the Spec-04, placing it effectively equal with the 270R at 1300 RPM, which has two fans, and SilverStone's RL06 at 1000 RPM. The SilverStone RL06 is able to cool significantly better even at this reduced 1000 RPM number, and does so while retaining a similar noise output. That said, it's also an extra $15, so it just comes down to a cost argument and how much the noise and thermals matter to the user. Now, this is a fine case for $50. It's certainly warm, warmer than the other ones we've tested, but those tend to be better for thermals. They're more expensive, they come with more fans, or just better sort of airflow path design, if you can call it that, whereas this one's got half the front panel blocked off. So you lose some performance there because of that. But it's an okay case. If you're building a $50 ultra budget machine, something like a G4 560 with maybe a 1050 or 1050 Ti, it's a good pairing. What you might want to consider, again, at $8, so it's really a $58 case, buy a fan with it. That's certainly worth it. And if it's within range, consider some alternatives. The alternatives of note would be Corsair's own 270R, which is a case that we liked quite a bit when it came out. It's got two fans for the windowed version. The design is good enough that you're going to get better cooling overall. And of course, it doesn't all come down to fans. It has a pretty good noise control as well, because the front panel is largely blocked off, but it's got those wide side intakes on the front. Another option, if you still want Corsair, the Spec-alpha currently is about $63 after rebate, which brings it pretty close to this one, and it's got a similar aesthetic, if that's really why you're looking at this case. And then finally, the SilverStone RL06 at $75 is a really good buy if you care about thermals and not much else. which depending on what you're building and who you are and how you're using your system, if you're going to run CPU or GPU at 100% when doing renders and things like that, it's a worthwhile investment to just go that extra $15 and get something that'll keep it cool while still being affordable compared to some of the more expensive cases. So those are the ones to look at. This one is okay. It's not offensive in any capacity. Just add a fan stock. It's probably not the best thing you could buy, but once you add a fan, it is a good purchase. So that is all for this one. As always, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us fund more testing like this one. It is quite in depth to do stuff like what we're doing with cases lately. You go to store.gamersnexus.net to buy shirts, or gamersnexus.net for the site. Subscribe for more. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.